So here are the solutions to these 5 questions. So first, the 2 activities are named Catalog Activity and the Editor Activity. Secondly, the type of button that we're using to connect the 2 activities is a floating action button. So notice that the toggle button, if we looked it up in the documentation, is sort of like an on and off switch, whereas the spinner is similar to a drop-down menu. Third, which of these menu options exists in either activity? Well, there's a delete all pets menu option, as well as an insert dummy data menu option. Now for the 4th question, asking what view allows us to show a drop-down menu for the spinner. In this case, we used a spinner. You might have looked up what the picker was in the Android documentation, and if you did, you would have seen that it's a dialog that's commonly used to set dates and times. Whereas the checkbox is just a simple checkbox used to help the user select an option. And for the last question of what activity method did we need to override in order to handle the menu option clicks, well, that would have been the onOptionsItemSelected method. So the onCreateOptions menu method creates the options menu in the app bar, while this one specifically, the onOptionsItemSelected method, will help us set up what should happen when the user selects one of the options from the menu. So we don't need to use the onClick here because we have this method here specifically handling menu clicks. Now let's take a more detailed look into the starter code and see where we found all these answers. So once you've downloaded the starter code and run the app on your device, this is the first screen that should open up, and this is our catalog activity. So eventually we'll be building it out so the catalog activity displays a list of all the pets that are in our shelter database. Now down in this bottom right corner here is our floating action button. So clicking on it takes us to our second activity, our editor activity. So this screen allows the user to input information about a specific pet, such as the name, the breed, the gender, and the weight. I also want to point out that the gender here uses a spinner, which allows the user to select from a limited list of 3 choices about the pet's gender. Now up here in the toolbar, there's a couple things going on. First, there's this save button. Notice currently clicking on it doesn't do any action. Eventually we'll be building it out so that clicking that button allows the user to save information off into the database. To the right of it is this overflow menu. Now clicking on that pulls up a delete option. This right now also doesn't do any specific action, but eventually we'll be building it out so that the user can delete a pet that was incorrectly entered into the table. Now back here is the up arrow, and it allows us to navigate back to the parent activity. And the parent activity here is our catalog activity. So notice here in the catalog activity, it also has an overflow menu. Now clicking on that displays 2 options, either inserting dummy data or deleting all the pets. Neither of these do any action just yet as well, and don't worry, we'll make sure that we build those out. Alright, so now that we know what the app looks like, let's take a look at the code. So let's start with our Android manifest file. So this file contains all the important information about our app that the Android system needs to know. Things such as the package name, the app name, and the activity names. Now if we have an app that has multiple activities, the Android manifest also indicates which activity is the parent activity. And in our case, it's the catalog activity. Next, expanding out the Java folder, we see this is where all the logic of the app happens. But let's skip over that for now and head over to the res folder. And remember, here is where we store everything that's related to the appearance of the app. So things such as XML files, images, and other media files. Now under the layout folder here, we have our activity layout XML file and our activity editor XML file. So these 2 files define the layout for the 2 screens of our app. And back under the res folder, we have our mipmap folder. And remember, these are specific for building out our app icons. And that is a big icon. Alright, so back to our resources folder, we have our values folder. And inside here, we can define files that define the colors, text strings, and the style, as well as any string arrays that we're using in this app. So specifically, in this app, we're using an array to store the gender options. Remember here, we saw that gender is stored in a spinner and has 3 different options. Alright, let's head back to the Java folder. So first off is the catalog activity. And this was the main screen of the app where the pet information will eventually be displayed. Now when this activity is created in onCreate, a floating action button is set up using a click listener. And this will use an intent to open up our editor activity. Now following that is this method here, onCreateOptions menu. And this creates the options menu in the app bar. The following method here, the onOptionsItem selected method, allows us to set up what happens when the user actually selects one of those options. So currently, the two options that exist are insert dummy data and then deleting all the entries. But right now, they're not set up to do anything just yet. So lastly, let's check out the editor activity. So this activity is where the user can either create a new pet or edit information about an existing one. So up top, we have several private edit text variables, as well as a variable down here called mgender. So this variable stores an integer value that corresponds to the gender of the pet. So note that we can only have 3 values. 0 that corresponds with unknown, 1 that corresponds with male, and 2 that corresponds with female. Now further down in this activity, we have the onCreate method. And here is where we connect all those edit text variables to their views. So all these edit text variables to their views. And we also set up our drop-down spinner here. Now, in order to populate the spinner with the list of options, we needed to create an array adapter. And that uses the string array that we saw earlier that existed in the res file. So remember this one here? And so that corresponds with this name here, this array gender options. So for this spinner, we also specify its layout and the drop-down style of the spinner. So when the user selects an item from that drop-down spinner, this one here, we check that selection. Did they select male, female, or unknown? And depending on which one they selected, we set the variable mgender to the appropriate value. Now, because we created an instance of the abstract adapter variable class here, and we did that inline, we were required to define this method, onNothingSelected. And I called that out in the comment here. So if nothing is selected, then by default, mgender is set to unknown. Alright, so the last thing I want to call out in the editor activity here is the onOptionsItemSelected method. So remember, this method here allows us to set up what action happens when a user selects something from the menu. So the last thing I want to call out here is the onOptionsItemSelected method in the editor activity. So here, we can set up what happens when the user clicks on a menu option in the app bar overflow menu. So remember, we had our 3 options. So 1, the saving check mark. Currently, it's not set up to do anything just yet. Next, we have our delete menu option, also not plugged into any action. And then lastly, this android.r.id.home case, which allows the user to navigate back up to the parent activity, which is our catalog activity.